Thank you again, Professor Miller, and your questions too, Bruce. Our next speaker, this is a really important and burgeoning area, whistleblower rights, as you can see from some of the recent cases, Edward Snowden, Thomas Drake, and many others. But Tom Devine has been Mr. Whistleblower Rights and Remedies for over 30 years. As legal director of the Government Accountability Project, known as GAP, he's written, lobbied, settled, and gone global for thousands of whistleblowers, those employees who courageously exercise freedom of speech to challenge abuses of power that betray the public trust. All kinds of state, national, and international laws bear some or a lot of his imprint in the whistleblower area, including our National Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989 and the recent Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act just last year for federal employees, supported by both left and right members of Congress, by the way. Tom was too young to attend our first whistleblower conference in 1971, and was that ever a raucous affair. But no one since has carried the torch and institutionalized it in our legal system and raised public expectations for ethical whistleblowers more than Tom Devine. And now he speaks to us on whistleblowing and the power of truth.
Well, thanks for being diehards and sticking around to listen to me. I really appreciate diehards because I'm a lawyer for them. And it's because they make a difference, as we'll be going over in this talk. I also wanted to thank Ralph for putting together this program. Just coming up and listening to Professor Miller's talk made the whole trip from DC to Boston and back worthwhile. Let's start this out 36 years ago when I was struggling to decide whether I'd get a legal education at Stanford, Berkeley, or an experimental law school run by Edgar Cahn called Antioch Law School. Antioch taught the law largely through participation in a legal aid clinical apprenticeship program, and they gave unprecedented freedom to create your own curriculum. It was very attractive to me not to drop out of society for 3 years, but I was a little bit nervous about being self-indulgent. Maybe the price for not being bored and irrelevant for 3 years is that I would create obstacles to my calling and vision to be a political activist, which was inspired by Ralph Nader, being an intern at his Critical Mass project. The clincher, though, was when Antioch's admissions director went over the previous year's hiring for the most coveted position in DC for recent law graduates, the U.S. Attorney's Office. 3 out of the 5 hires were from Antioch Law School. 1 was from Harvard, 1 was from GW. The reason? They had proved themselves. They weren't just a resume. They were proven talent. And what it proved to me is that by staying relevant, I could actually be more marketable for the most competitive jobs. And Antioch was true to its word. In the middle of my second year there, they approved a legal clinic, satellite legal clinic at the Government Accountability Project, which is a whistleblower support organization, then at the Institute for Policy Studies. It was inspired by Daniel Ellsberg, who packaged the Pentagon Papers at IPS. For the last year and a half, I paid $5,000 tuition and worked full-time at Government Accountability Project and finished my law degree. And I've been there ever since. Well, that's more than enough about my odyssey to get here today. Let's talk about whistleblowers. Now, who are these guys? Are they heroes or are they traitors? Well, actually, they're either, depending on your own activities. Depending on my behavior, a whistleblower may be my savior or my worst nightmare. We've heard a lot recently about a war on whistleblowers. Well, that's inherent in the definition that Ralph just shared. These are people who use free speech rights to challenge abuses of power that betray the public trust. And of course there's a war on whistleblowers. I don't even think of retaliation as immoral at this point. It's the war on whistleblowers has existed as long as we've had organized society. Don't blame President Obama. It'll continue as long as we have organized society. It's the institutional equivalent of the animal instinct to eliminate a threat. When an animal is threatened, it doesn't want to have a dialogue. It wants to kill whatever is threatening it, eliminate it. When somebody slugs me, I don't think, well, maybe there's a lesson to be learned. What did I do that caused it? I want to flatten that son of a gun for two reasons. One, so that I can't be hit again. And two, because I'm mad. I've been hurt. And whistleblowers will always be an endangered species in whatever institution they work at. Well, how does GAP help them? First of all, we help defend them against retaliation. We do it through representing them, but through legal campaigns rather than just legal cases. Campaigns that seek to unite the isolated whistleblower with all of the institutions in society that should be benefiting from their knowledge. So that instead of a hostile bureaucracy surrounding the whistleblower, society surrounds the corrupt bureaucracy, and that turns information into power. Second, we help them to investigate their charges, to turn the initial single pebble of the truth into an avalanche of the truth. And when we get that, it's a lot easier to say one person is a nut or has a hidden agenda or is dishonest than it is to say that 50 or 75 or 100, everybody but the person benefiting is a liar. The third way that we help is by working ceaselessly to strengthen the laws protecting free speech in this context. And the fourth way is by sharing our lessons learned through books, law review articles, a clinical program with DC School of Law. And here's where I get to make my pitch for everybody who's watching this here or who watches it on video. We have a very active internship program. Consider us. I never really care whether somebody has a degree or what their pedigree is. If they prove themselves, they'll be right in the front lines in a partnership role, challenging abuses of power with our attorneys. Well, that's more than enough about GAP. Let's talk a little bit more about the identity of whistleblowers. Now, there's nothing magical about this term. In some countries, they're called bell ringers, after the people who climb the church tower and ring the bells to warn of danger. In other countries, they're called lighthouse keepers, after those who shine light on the rocks that otherwise would sink ships. No matter what label we give them, this is freedom of speech when it counts the most. It's easy to have freedom of speech in a sports stadium and call a referee any names you want when the referee screws up the penalties. Well, why is that? Well, number one, it's hard to retaliate against 40 or 50,000 people. A lot easier to go after one person. And number two, the referee's screw-up isn't a secret. Everybody saw it. Probably it's been television. It's probably replayed. Well, whistleblowers are far different. Only one or two people may know the truth that threatens the power structure. Makes it very significant and very, very treacherous. It also is freedom of speech that makes the most difference. We usually think of whistleblowing as the freedom to protest, freedom of dissent, but this is very important. It makes them the lifeline for accountability. You can't really have successful prosecutions unless Witnesses, people bear witness with their testimony. It can be protesting in the streets to being a witness in a government corruption trial. But I don't think that's as important as another aspect of this, the freedom to warn. Through this form of free speech, we can prevent avoidable disasters before it's too late for anything except damage control, picking up the pieces and pointing the finger. Whose fault is it? While those are important, they're not going to be much solace to the families or the victims of tragedies that never should have happened. And because of the freedom to warn, whistleblowers should be the most valuable resource for organizational leaders who unfortunately, as a rule, view them as threats rather than as the canaries in the coal mine who could save their professional lives or careers. Then there's the third form of whistleblowing that's even more significant. That's, I call it the freedom to create or the freedom to challenge conventional wisdom. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's go back to Galileo and Copernicus. 1,000 years ago, the conventional wisdom was the Earth is as flat as the top of this podium, and the rest of the universe circled around us. Well, thanks to them, we know better now. But they got the whistleblower treatment. Galileo spent the rest of his life under house arrest for challenging conventional wisdom. And I think they personify who these folks are. I call them the living histories that refuse to be rewritten, and whether we love them or hate them, whether they're right or wrong, they ask the hard questions that keep society from getting stagnant in ruts. They keep us on our toes. They're the pioneers of change and paradigm shifts. One of my first clients and mentors, a gentleman named Ernie Fitzgerald from the Pentagon, called whistleblowing committing the truth, because you're treated like you committed a crime. And that's very ironic, because these folks are the human factors. They're the Achilles heel of bureaucratic corruption. The most heroic clients that I've had have oftentimes come from the most corrupt institutions. Well, that's enough of a sales pitch. How about a little evidence to back up all this rhetoric? Well, let's start with the False Claims Act, America's most effective anti-corruption statute. And this is a law that's a private attorney general statute that allows whistleblowers to do more than make noise. They can file a whistleblowing lawsuit to challenge fraud in government contracts. And let's look at the track record since we revitalized this law in 1986. The previous year, the Justice Department, acting alone, was able to collect $26 million from fraud in government contracts. It was a big year for them. Usually it was $6 to $9 million. In the 25 plus years since, the average recovery is over $1 billion from whistleblower lawsuits challenging this fraud. Last year, it's going up like with a bullet. Last year, one case alone brought in $5 billion. These folks are very effective if we give them a chance, if we enfranchise them. Or let's go to an international example with an intergovernmental example, the World Bank, where Paul Wolfowitz came in a few years ago, mastermind of the Iraq War, one of the most powerful people in the world. And he was going to clean up corruption in the rest of the world through the World Bank. Well, thanks to whistleblowers, we learned that his primary qualification would be teaching how to engage in corruption. And as powerful as he was, within a few months of the first whistleblower coming to our office, he had to resign. Or let's go to those who have exposed the threats to freedom from our own government. It's been coming up here a lot today. Since 2006 at GAP, we've represented 5 of the 7 whistleblowers who've exposed that Big Brother has moved into every American family's home. He lives in our computers, our smartphones, anything that transmits electronic communications, and he listens to all of it. We wouldn't know about this without whistleblowers. And I think that this issue personified, it illustrates a microcosm of the contradictions of this phenomenon. President Obama said he welcomed a great national debate about privacy. But he wants to put in jail the guy who made the debate possible. They get right to the heart of our society's contradictions. Let's give the other extreme, defending America against threats from terrorists abroad. The Paul Revere whistleblowers, I call them. I'll give an example of a gentleman named Robert McLean. In 2003, our counterintelligence services confirmed a threat that initially came from Saudi intelligence, that there was going to be a more ambitious rerun of 9/11. This time, the hijackers would target all of our West Coast cities, the capital itself, and European capitals, an international strike. It would make 9/11 seem more like a preview of a coming attraction. Well, the federal air marshals went into emergency training. They spent, this is it. This is like D-Day for fighting terrorists. But on Friday afternoon, when they finished the training, and the strike was going to be the next week, they all got a text message that said, cancel all your long-distance flight missions. Those were the planes that were targeted. And be sure and cancel your hotel reservations. Well, we learned what had happened subsequently. The air marshals had blown their budget on buddy system contracts, and they're going to have to go back to Congress and ask for more money. But if they didn't pay any hotel bills for the last 2 months of the fiscal year, they wouldn't have to face the music. So they canceled all the air marshal missions in the midst of a terrorist alert. Well, an air marshal named Robert McLean asked his supervisor about this. He asked the Office of Inspector General about this. They all told him, look, you're not going to accomplish anything except get yourself fired. So let it go. Leave it alone. Well, he was a whistleblower, so he wouldn't do it. He went to MSNBC to see if they could get some answers from Congress. Sunday night, MSNBC ran a story. Monday morning, President Bush was deluged with questions that he couldn't answer about this. He didn't know anything about it. That day, there was all sorts of press conferences from members of Congress, and within 24 hours, DHS put out a press release saying, it was all a mistake. We were never planning to cancel the coverage, and there was just a mistake in communications. He made a real difference. Or there's a gentleman named Franz Geil. Franz is a science advisor for the Marines. He found out that by failing to deliver ready-to-ship, paid-for, fully inspected, mine-resistant armored vehicles, we were having an increase in casualties in the Iraq War of about 1/3 of unnecessary casualties. Thanks to Franz, those MRAPs, as they're called, were delivered, and the casualties dropped sharply. Or let's go to consumer protection, Vioxx. We were hearing earlier about the tort lawyers' effective work challenging Vioxx. But they wouldn't have known that the super painkiller was a killer painkiller, which had caused nearly 50,000 deaths, as much as many Americans has died in the Vietnam War, the same range. If it weren't for a whistleblower from the FDA named Dr. David Graham, who testified at the Senate Judiciary Committee and exposed the threats from this drug. Or there's the 400 meat inspectors that I've taken statements from, and about 100 more since I went on to different beats at Gap. 6 times they stopped the Department of Agriculture from turning government-inspected bases for the USDA seal of approval into a corporate honor system that would back the government's seal of wholesomeness. Or let's go to environmental examples. The Zimmer nuclear power plant was 97% complete when the first whistleblower came out. And by the time we'd had 50 whistleblowers give affidavits, we learned that this plant, although the ratepayers were being charged for the most expensive nuclear-grade steel in the world, were paying for a plant that was built with steel from automobile junkyards that had been melted down, and hundreds of other allegations like that were confirmed. Or there's radiation storage. About 15 years ago at the Hanford nuclear waste site, the contractor, Kaiser Corporation, held a press conference to say they'd lost track of 10,000 gallons of radioactive waste. But don't worry, they were just saying that to be honest, and there was no chance it could get into the water supply. Well, thanks to a whistleblower using their records, we learned the real figure was 4 billion gallons that they couldn't account for. And when we sent divers into the Columbia River, which is the water supply for the Pacific Northwest, there were already traces of radiation. It sparked intensive corrective action. Or the last example, human rights. This is about 10 years ago. And I still shake my head when I think of it. Until about 10 years ago, when international visitors came to our country, they would be arbitrarily accused of drug smuggling without any evidence. It usually involved attractive women, and it was usually towards the end of the workday when you could get overtime for stopping somebody and going through the whole rigmarole. If there wasn't any drugs in their luggage, they would have them do a body cavity search, where you don't just look at the outside, but you look at all the insides. If they didn't find any drugs then, they would take them to a hospital and do laboratory tests for up to 4 days. During this time, they couldn't contact their families. They couldn't get in touch with a lawyer. They didn't have any rights. It was like their bodies were properties of the US government. Well, thanks to a whistleblower, Kathy Harris, a customs inspector, the truth came out. The Customs Service couldn't defend the practice, and the time was reduced from 4 days to 2 hours before your constitutional rights, the same rights kick in that an American would have. Well, I could continue for quite a while, but I think I've made the point about these people. And is there a war on whistleblowers? Of course there is. They speak truth to power. But at the Government Accountability Project, we try to go an extra step. We team up with them to turn the truth into power. And I hope that folks who hear this talk will consider joining us on the front lines at GAP so we can make a difference together.
Note my earlier remarks. Thank you, Tom. My earlier remarks, note two things. Look at the enormous achievement with the small budget. I see Jason Atkins here, president of Public Citizen, who does the same thing. And just think of that. When you hear me say it's easier than we think, just think if there were 10 gaps and how much more they could do, and it still wouldn't pay the head of J.P. Morgan for a month. And the second is, and Tom couldn't get this across because he was short on time, the emotional energy that's expended in dealing with whistleblowers and what they have to go through and their families and their loss of jobs and treated as pariah by the very accusers who were the criminals and the violators in the first place. Talk about a perverse incentive here. And all the work that Tom and others at GAP have to go through to deal with these very, very human problems. It takes a toll. Do they get discouraged? No. Do they back off? No. Do they burn out? No. That's the resilience of the civic personality. He and his colleagues have authored the Whistleblower Handbook, which is very important. I think you've got some up here. They're up here, and maybe some materials there. And by all means, go into this area. This is the great act of conscience that a rule of law democracy should stimulate. And this new law that Tom and others got through is going to give enormous opportunity and incentives for full-time careers defending whistleblowing. And it wasn't everything we wanted, but it's going to expand the field here. Now, I asked Jeffrey Clements to come in last because, number one, I couldn't believe that there are classes at the Harvard Law School, at this time, and this is the enormously important bedrock of so many of the problems in our society, and that is the status of the artificial person called the corporation. And he has written a book entitled Citizens Union versus, he's written a book entitled Corporations Are Not People: Why They Have More Rights Than You Do and What You Can Do About It. I've read this twice, marked it up. The first time to absorb his historical range about how great giant corporations, creations of the state, they don't exist without being created by the state. Investors do not create corporations, they fund them. They're chartered by the state. These corporations have powerfully seized privileges and immunities and rights unreachable by mere human beings, no matter how rich the latter may become. The second time I read it was to marvel at the clarity and precision of his writing. What could have been a dry, arcane subject, he turned into a documented wake-up call at what Justice Louis Brandeis once warned could become Frankensteins in our own midst. The corporate entity exerting supremacy over we the people and turning the preamble of our Constitution into a de facto we the corporations. Students taking corporation law should read Corporations Are Not People before classes start in this course. And I might add, I've just been informed that one Harvard Law professor has graced us and is going to make some remarks after Jeffrey finishes. John Hanson. He's a very, very popular professor for all the right reasons here at the law school teaching corporations. So Jeffrey Clements will be speaking on, quote, aggressively and with determination, the corporate capture of the Constitution and the courts.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you all for being such troopers to stick with this very long day, and in some ways maybe a difficult, challenging, somber day, because we've had a lot of bad news, haven't we? And the news is bad. So I'm going to add some more bad news. But we're talking, I think, in a way that is important, and in a way the country at large is talking, and that we have issues that aren't easily fixed. That it is not exaggeration or hyperbole to talk about the death of a republic and a real question of whether democracy makes it. And in many ways, I think Citizens United versus the FEC captured that for the country. A lot of different things did, but my experience with Citizens United, I've been out in about 26, 27 states the last couple of years talking about it. And I can tell you that people get it. They know that Citizens United stands for, and just the refresher for those who have been in an igloo or something the last few years, Citizens United, the reminder, was the case that struck down the McCain-Feingold law that restricted corporate spending in certain periods before an election. It wasn't even that aggressive a campaign finance law, but it limited corporate and union spending to try to give the people a chance to have a less dominated election, less dominated by big money. That was the intention, and it goes back to the Tillman Act at the turn of the century, the last century. But it was struck down 5-4 by a court that had upheld the very same law only 6 years before in the McConnell case. And the only thing that changed was Sandra Day O'Connor retired, and Chief Justice Rehnquist died, and replaced by Professor Miller's old student, I hadn't realized that, John Roberts as Chief Justice, and Samuel Alito as Justice. And we live in an era now where precedent doesn't matter. What matters is, do you have the 5 votes and power, and you're going to use them. They had the 5 votes, they used them. 6-year-old case that went the other way, didn't matter, overturned. So I want to talk a little bit about Citizens United and where it came from and what I think it means in the sort of larger scheme of the things we're talking about today in a lot of different areas. And it's become, I think, a little unfortunately common for even the best, most publicly interested law professors, and I include in that category friends I deeply admire, Larry Lessig here at Harvard, Kent Greenfield at BC, corporate law professor, Rick Hasen, who writes a lot about election law. It's become very fashionable to respond to the country's reading of Citizens United as corporations are people, they have the same rights. How could the court have done that? To say, no, the court didn't actually say that. It's really about just money and politics. Don't look at that sort of corporate thing. Even Kent Greenfield at one point said that corporate personhood is about as relevant to the constitutional analysis as Tom Brady's golf game is to how he's going to do on the football field. Sort of just this non sequitur idea. My friend Larry Lessig, who I think the world of and has sacrificed great amounts of time and energy and ringing the alarm and doing hard work for the country around Citizens United, says it's this constitutional amendment movement is and I quote, a gaggle of angry activists are running, is the wrong solution. And that, he's got another solution that involves getting money under control and getting elections publicly funded, which I think is a very good idea. But I think we have to, I think this kind of discussion is so important because I think the gap is widening between what even the best lawyers and law professors are willing to talk about and what the rest of the country is willing to talk about. And I'll give some examples of that. It's not a gaggle of angry activists out there who think Citizens United is about corporate personhood. It's a corporate power case, as Professor Miller said. That's what it means. And I'll do that if you'll bear with me. And don't worry, I won't go on long because we have a World Series game tonight to get to across the river. Or the TV is, in my case. But I think we got to look at where Citizens United came from first, and what it has meant for the country, and then I think the good news is I'm going to end with good news, that we're not going to end on a downer, that the country is doing extraordinary things to take on corporate power and these issues that we're talking about today, and I'll give some examples of that. So Citizens United, in my view, is a corporate power case. It is a campaign finance case, but it's not just that. And to look at where it came from, I go back to 1971 in the book An Earth Day and the great work of Ralph Nader and many, many millions of Americans. 20 million Americans came out on that first Earth Day in 1970. That's hard to believe when you look at the state of our environmental debate today. But 20 million Americans of all sorts of political viewpoints came out to demand change in the sort of century of externalization of corporate harm onto the environment that we'd been doing, and it had a dramatic effect. Well, there was a reaction to not the environmental laws, the public health laws, the worker rights laws, the civil rights laws. There was a reaction, and Citizens United is the end game of that reaction. And the starting point of that reaction is a memo, some of you may know, the Powell memo as it's called. And it was a memo that was secret at the time, 1971, written by Lewis Powell. He was a Richmond, Virginia lawyer. His clients were the largest corporations. He was on the board of the Philip Morris Cigarette Corporation. Not just on the board, he was on the executive committee of Philip Morris at the height of the cigarette conspiracy. And he was on the board of about a dozen other corporations. He was an advisor to the Chamber of Commerce, who he directed this memo to. And it was a diagnosis of what had gone wrong for corporations as he saw it. We had environmental laws now, we had worker rights laws, employee laws, and he even identified some specific targets, and I usually don't do this, but given our distinguished host today, I'm going to quote from just one of his sort of Lewis Powell's identity of who the enemy was. And in his memo he says, perhaps to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, this is Lewis Powell, Perhaps the single most effective antagonist of American business is Ralph Nader, who, thanks largely to the media, has become a legend in his own time and an idol of millions of Americans. And then he quoted, and that was true, he was and is an idol of millions of Americans, because millions of Americans actually agree we have a problem with corporate power and we need to balance it for the good of all, and for the good of our civilization. So he went on at length about the passion that rules in Ralph Nader, quoting a Fortune magazine article, and that he is aimed at smashing utterly the target of his hatred, which is corporate power. So that was the problem that Lewis Powell was identifying to the U.S. Chamber, is that there's people out here who are actually talking about corporate power, and Americans are responding, and we're getting laws. We have to do something. So it's a remarkable memo that is worth, you can find online or check with me. I'll direct you to a copy of it. But what's really remarkable is what his prescription was and how it was executed. And it was a call for an organized, very well-funded, very long-term campaign to transform American society with corporate money and corporate power. And I'm going to quote a little bit once again from the memo. Independent and uncoordinated activity by individual corporations, as important as this is, will not be sufficient. Strength lies in organization, in careful long-range planning, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, in the scale of financing available only through joint effort, and in the political power available only through united action. He wrote, political power is necessary, must be assiduously cultivated, and when necessary used aggressively and with determination, without embarrassment and without reluctance. He then turned his attention to the courts, particularly the Supreme Court. Especially with an activist-minded Supreme Court, the judiciary may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change. So here you have a memo to the U.S. Chamber describing what needs to be done and focusing on an activist-minded Supreme Court. Now you could say, okay, so what? Who's Lewis Powell anyway? Well, Lewis Powell, as many of you know, was appointed to the Supreme Court about 2 months after writing this memo. He was confirmed almost unanimously. Nobody knew about the memo. It was secret. And he went on the Supreme Court in 1971. He then wrote in the space of 6 years, Lewis Powell wrote himself 4 Supreme Court cases that created what we know as the corporate speech doctrine. The idea that corporations weren't, as Ralph said, creations of the state or entities that were responsible to the public. No, instead they're speakers, they're persons, they're people with rights. And if you don't believe it, you can read the amicus briefs that started pouring into the court from organizations that hadn't existed until the Chamber and corporations started funding them. I include in that the U.S. Chamber Litigation Project, the Washington Legal Foundation, ALEC, some of you may know of, the American Legislative Exchange Council, dozens of these legal foundations and corporate-funded groups that were an execution of this plan and have been for the past 30 years, funding litigation, funding the change in our society that Lewis Powell called for and that Lewis Powell helped create by writing these 5-4 decisions. They overturned environmental laws. They overturned election laws. One of the cases most relied upon by Citizens United is a case right out of Massachusetts, Bank of Boston versus Bellotti. Bellotti was the Attorney General of Massachusetts, as you know, and the case struck down a Massachusetts law prohibiting corporate spending in citizen ballot initiatives. Struck it down, said that Bank Boston and Gillette Corporation have the First Amendment rights of people, and it was the first time in American history a restriction on corporate spending to try to keep elections clean had ever been struck down. Obviously Lewis Powell can't do it all himself, and it wouldn't have happened if he had tried. My point isn't, I have a secret document here that's the answer to the conspiracy. No, but my point is that where we are is an intentional result of a well-funded movement that involved a lot of people, and as he said, a lot of organization, a lot of money over a very long term. These cases, even before Citizens United, had struck down a wave of public interest laws under a theory that corporations are speakers, and essentially if a corporation has a business plan or a profit plan and a public interest law interferes with it, it interferes with their expression and corporate speech. So I did a brief in the Citizens United case. I had just left the Attorney General's office across the river in Boston, and the court had announced a few weeks later that they were going to rehear argument in the Citizens United case. And in my time at the AG's office, we had seen the scope of enforcement of public interest law, let alone getting new law, was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking because of this doctrine of corporate rights. So I was going to write an article about it. Instead, I wrote an amicus brief and sent it to the court. And then here we are. We launched Free Speech for People after that, because it was clear to me that from Buckley versus Vallejo on the campaign finance side to this corporate speech theory that never existed in American history until our time, there was no question what the court was going to do and that we had to do something about it. So since Citizens United, we obviously have the big money problem, okay? And I won't go into the details. I think there's a lot of good resources on that. We know the impacts. There's a $7 billion federal election in 2012. Sheldon Adelson himself spending $98 million through super PACs. What my only point there will be, we have to keep our eye on, is where that money comes from. It is a tiny, tiny, tiny sliver. 0.5% of the people make 80% of the political spending. 152 people came up with 60% of the super PAC money. And about a few dozen more make 75% of all that super PAC money. That is why people like Bill Moyers say we're a plutocracy. It's why Jim Leach, an Iowa Republican congressman, recently left the Congress, gave a speech here in Cambridge at the JFK School not long ago to say we have become an oligarchy, and compared Citizens United to the Dred Scott case as how damaging it is to the future of the republic. And then we had just not long ago President Carter, former president of the United States, say that we no longer have a functioning democracy in America. And think of that. We had a former president of the country saying we don't have a functioning democracy, and it was almost not reported anywhere. I mean, you got to search to find that speech. And that is the state we've come to. To say oligarchy, plutocracy is not the words anymore of angry activists. It's the words of former presidents, former Republican Congress people, and so on. So it is real. So what can we do about it? What we're doing at Free Speech for People, two main things. The constitutional amendment campaign across the country, which I'll talk more about, and a legal advocacy program. And we're going to bridge the amendment movement, which citizens across this country want this to happen, with the law schools, the lawyers, the judges. And I'll just tell you quickly as Montana as an example. So Montana had a law prohibiting corporate spending in elections. And after Citizens United was decided, Attorney General Steve Bullock testified in Congress, and we've had this law for 100 years. We were owned by copper corporations before we had it. I have to defend it. I don't think Citizens United prevented us in Montana from making sure we don't get owned by corporations anymore. Well, he was basically saying, sue me. They sued him. He was sued by a corporate front group called Western Tradition Partnership. They always have good names. Said it violated corporate rights. He defended the law, and a lot of interesting information that I don't have time to go into came out in the litigation. We filed an amicus brief at Free Speech for People with local Montana businesses, the American Sustainable Business Council, and to the surprise of, well, us and everyone else, the Montana Supreme Court agreed, upheld the law, said that Citizens United could not have meant what it meant, and they upheld the law. And I want to read just one brief paragraph of Justice James Nelson, of the Montana Supreme Court. He's a 60-something Republican appointed to the court, on the court for 20 years in Montana Supreme Court. He has just retired, and not to give away the punchline, but he has joined the Free Speech for People Legal Advisory Committee after retiring. And he said this in the Montana case: "For starters, the notion that corporations are disadvantaged in the political realm is unbelievable." That's what Justice Kennedy had said in Citizens United, that corporations are disadvantaged. Nelson went on, "The truth is that corporations wield inordinate power. It is hard to tell where government ends and corporate America begins. The transition is seamless and overlapping." And he went on, "I'm compelled to say something about corporate personhood. I find the entire concept offensive. Corporations are artificial creatures of law. Human beings are persons, and it is an affront to the inviolable dignity of our species that courts have created a legal fiction which forces people, human beings, to share fundamental natural rights with soulless creations of government." This is a now retired, but a 60-something-year-old Republican in Montana who's been on the Supreme Court for 20 years. He has no trouble knowing what Citizens United is about. So it went up to the Supreme Court, summarily reversed, 5-4, the same lineup. But I say that to you, that we have good news even in that. You could say, well, you lost. What did you do? Well, I'll tell you. So Montana basically defied the United States Supreme Court. And you had 4 United States Supreme Court justices saying, good for Montana. The summary reversal had 4 dissenters. Justice Breyer said we should reverse Citizens United. We made a mistake. So we are continuing to keep the pressure on that case. We are continuing to make sure we're only one justice away from fixing that. But here's what the better news, because I think the solutions we're talking about, there's no silver bullets. There's no, oh, if we just get one more judge, or if we just do this or that. There's so much we have to do. So this amendment movement works by constitutional amendment resolutions around the country, and 16 states have now adopted these resolutions saying corporations don't have constitutional rights, money isn't speech. That's shorthand. I can give you more information about it. Well, we had that ready to go on the Montana ballot initiative the day the Supreme Court decided, as we expected they would, that Montana, the Supreme Court was wrong and struck down the Montana limitation on corporate spending in elections. That day we had a video launched with Governor Schweitzer, who's a Democrat, standing beside Lieutenant Governor John Bollinger, who's a Republican, saying we don't agree on anything, but we agree on this, and corporate power. We need a constitutional amendment to overturn the Supreme Court's decision and to return democracy to the people. The ballot initiative was on the ballot in November, as I said. If you read it, you will think it was written by many people in this room. It talks not just about money and politics, it talks about corporations and corporate power, and says corporations do not have constitutional rights. We, the people, decide on the power and privilege and duties of corporations, not the other way around. So with that on the ballot in a state that Mitt Romney won, 55%, it passed 75% to 25%. And we see this over and over again. Republicans get this, Democrats get this. We have an opportunity for serious conversation and debate across this country, not with just activists, but with everyday Americans of every political viewpoint, because Americans get it. And when the chips are down, I think we will win this. We will get a constitutional amendment. We will force a conversation about corporate power that even some of the best folks think is fringy. It's not fringy. People get it. And then we can change this country as we have done before. Remember, this would be the 28th Amendment, not the first. We have 28 amendments. People have been through fights in this country as big as the one that we face. And if people got discouraged, as some think we should now, we wouldn't have women voting. We wouldn't have equal rights for all, regardless of race. We wouldn't have. We had talk about the progressive income tax from David K. Johnston. That was struck down by the Supreme Court in the progressive era, and it took a constitutional amendment to put the federal tax onto the books. So we've been through this before, and the resiliency, I think it might have been Bruce Fein who was asked about can we win this? Can we win a republic back? And I think, yeah, we can. And Article 5, the amendment, is a way to do it, not just because it's a procedural device, but because it keeps the national conversation going, just like the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, didn't get there, but it changed the world by forcing Americans across the country to talk about what does equality mean, who are we as a country. That's where we are now. We're going to have a national conversation about it, and I think we're going to come out the other side with a much brighter future than it looks like right now. So thank you very much. I was supposed to say we're not going to have questions, but I will hang around because we're late and people have been here a long time. But thank you.
But if you have any questions at the reception for our last two speakers, by all means, just go up and chat with them. I just wanted to say for the record that we specifically invited all the faculty to drop by, the dean, any assistant deans, the graduate law students, the editors of law reviews. We saturated the Harvard Law School community. Thank you. I like the idea of the vehicle here. The name was chosen because it's flexibly ambiguous in terms of Shake 'em Up Harvard Law School Day, and it lends itself to interpretation by different people of goodwill, reflecting different initiatives. I do want to add one thing before we have a little reception, besides thanking all the speakers and assuring them we'll make every effort to have this presentation reach many more people and students, faculty, and others around the country. It's important to know that when we are told that litigation is too heavy for the court's burden and the dockets, it bears remembering that the entire budget of the federal court system, district court, circuit court, Supreme Court, in 1 year is less than half the cost of one aircraft carrier, of which we have 12. The next competitor is Italy with 2, and it's a completely obsolete technology unless it was to be used for empire. It's a sitting duck otherwise. And the second is, the last I heard, and I think this is a high figure, the entire budget for the state courts in our country, on the average, amounts to less than 2% of the overall state budget. So why are we rationing justice? To refer to Judge Learned Hand's favorite injunction for us. Thou shalt not ration justice if you are to have a democracy. And I think that's the rebuttal to any of the judges or their apologists who say that they can't handle this kind of case. It's as if we don't have space for justice. We have space for drones, and we have space for illegal wars, and we have space for corporate welfare, and we have space for tax loopholes, but we don't have money for justice. And I hope the law students will take that into account. And now let me just close on the note that I hope some of you who stayed for the duration here will spread the word about this presentation so that the other students can see it online. It'll probably, the best guide for that is it would be hlr.org, is that right? HarvardLawRecord.org? Oh, sorry, hlrecord.org for the Harvard Law Record website. And you'll be seeing a lot of good newspapers coming out of the Harvard Law Record, and more people will read it because they told me already they liked the feel of the paper and that they didn't really look at the website when it was transferred to the website. I want to thank the students who made this all possible. This is what a few student leaders and students of Horizon can produce. And that was true in the fabled 60s. It never was more than a few percentages of students who made it all happen. And you all can make it happen. Again, standing on their shoulders, being inspired by them, but actually doing much more than them, precisely because you're part of a legacy of what they strove for a more just society. Thank you very much.
just want another round of applause, please, and a thank you to Mr. Nader for putting on this incredible event and inspiring all of us. And really,